All right, in this demo, I will be deploying Microsoft SQL Server in AWS. Now, I'm not going to be deploying a standard EC2 instance and manually installing the database software. Instead, I'll be using RDS, Relational Database Service, where I have the option of leaving all of that underlying infrastructure grunt work to Amazon Web Services. So here in the console, I'm going to search for RDS. I'll click RDS in the results. Now, if I go to the databases view, any existing database instances, and there might even be something different than Microsoft SQL Server, will be shown in this list. Instead, we have a message that says no instances found. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create Database. And it's at this point that you get to choose which engine you want to use. Whether it's Amazon Aurora, MySQL, MariaDB, or in our case, Microsoft SQL Server. But notice up above, it's set to the standard create where you can configure some settings related to the database. Those related to high availability, security, backups, maintenance windows. Or you could just choose easy create where all those defaults are set. And if you need to change them, well, you can go in and change them after the fact. I'm going to leave it on standard create. So we've already selected Microsoft SQL Server below. The next thing to do is choose the management type. If we choose Amazon RDS, this is the standard managed service, which means automated patching of the underlying virtual machine OS and the database software. But if you need more flexibility, more control, you can choose Amazon RDS Custom, which gives you access to the underlying OS. I don't need that. I'm going to leave it on Amazon RDS. Then we have to choose the appropriate Microsoft SQL Server edition. So depending on what you need to do will determine what you select. So if you need a lot of high availability advanced functionality, you're going to need to be using SQL Server Enterprise Edition. But I'm just going to go ahead and stick with the standard SQL Server Express Edition, which maxes out at a database size up to 10 gig. Then we have to select the specific version of the SQL Server engine. I'll leave it on the newest version shown in the list. Down under Settings, it's got the database identifier set to database-1. I can change that now or after. I'm going to leave that for now. The default username is admin, and we can auto-generate a password or specify one. I'm going to specify and confirm my own custom password. Down below under Instance Configuration, we can select the DB instance class, which allows us to determine how many vCPUs, how much RAM is available. I'll leave it on db.t3.small. If I scroll down, I can specify storage details like the storage type, the allocated storage, and whether I want auto-scaling for storage for allowing automated growth as needed, up to the maximum threshold. Well, here it's got 1000 gig, but we know that SQL Server Express Edition maxes out at 10 gig. Scrolling down, I only want IPv4 connectivity. I'll let it use my default VPC, and I want to enable public accessibility. By default, it's set to no. I'm going to choose yes, and I can change this after the fact if I want to. I'm going to create a new security group called MS SQL Server Security Group. I can use this for multiple SQL Server instances if I deploy them. So down under Additional Configuration, the standard SQL listening port is 1433. I'm going to stick with that. I'm not going to enable SQL Server Windows authentication. I'm just going to use standard SQL logins. Down under Additional Configuration, we have database parameter groups, option groups, time zone preferences. These are all specific granular details. What I'm looking for here is the fact that automated backups is enabled with a default retention period of 7 days. And I could enable deletion protection to protect from accidental deletion of my SQL Server instance. And I have a bit of a sense here of what it's going to cost on a monthly basis. You want to be very careful with RDS database services that you deploy. You make sure that they're needed and are being used for business purposes. Otherwise, if they're just deployed and running, it's going to incur large monthly costs that you don't need. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and choose Create Database. And as it says at the top, it might take a few minutes for this to get created. Okay, so while the database is still launching, if I click on the database identifier, it takes me into the properties, where I can see the CPU utilization, the number of active sessions, the database class or the instance type, the region and availability zone where it was deployed, and down under Connectivity and Security, I have important connectivity information like the DNS endpoint name and the port that it's listening on, which of course is 1433. I can also go to Monitoring to view some other performance metrics related to this database instance. This is going to be important when it comes to monitoring the database during normal usage to see if you need to scale up. We can go to configuration to get some details about how it's configured, such as the fact that encryption is not enabled. And we can also go to maintenance and backups to see that configuration. But notice we've also got an automated backups view over here on the left. And remember that backups are enabled by default. Now, when I go back to my databases, if I open that database up again by clicking on its ID, I can choose to modify the database. I can reconfigure it if I decide, for example, that I need more or less horsepower. I want to change the database sizing. I can go ahead and do that. So I would go down in this case under instance configuration and make the appropriate selection and whatnot. Also, if I select the database radio button, I can also go to the actions menu. I can stop the database. Maybe I want to keep it, but I don't want it running right now. I want to reboot it because something doesn't seem to be working correctly with the underlying instance. I want to delete it, perhaps. Take a snapshot or restore it to an earlier point in time because, of course, backups are automatically being taken. Now, compared to setting up an entire server operating system and then installing all the tools required for Microsoft SQL Server, that is a pretty quick deployment.